1,496 people lost their lives when the Titanic sank. So Mr. Ismay chartered a Canadian cable ship, mackay-bennett, to recover the bodies. Now this cable ship was smaller than the Californian, but it was also the largest of three available at Halifax at that time. So it was hastily converted into a mock ship, and because it was undermanned for the task, they decided to hire fishermen from nearby villages to work as well. And all the nearby funeral homes were requested to give their additional supplies to the ship for the mission as well. Now, you may not know this, but a new identification method was born with the Titanic disaster. It was known as the Barnstead method after its founder, John Henry Barnstead, who was Registrar of Public Records from Halifax. So the method basically said that every body should be given a number, stripped, all the physical characteristics and clothing details noted, then all the belongings be placed in a canvas bag, and this bag would be catalogued with the body number. And to prevent souvenir hunting, the clothing should be later discarded. And to prevent theft, at least 2 people should be present at the inspection. And let's say if no belongings are found, then the shoes should be kept. And if there is no identification document found on the person, then a photograph should be taken for identification as well. And guess what? Even today we use it in disasters. So on 17th April, the mackay-bennett departed Halifax bound for the disaster site, carrying the following people and supplies. So on this voyage, it was commanded by Captain Lander, and he ordered his men that everybody should keep their logbooks updated regularly. And a great deal of what we know about this comes from these logbooks and the telegrams which they send to and from the ship to the shore, and the messages sent from the shore to the ship. And these telegrams actually became public after the White Star Line shut down. At 1:30 p.m., the steamer encountered fog and reduced its speed till the fog lifted at 6:35. Then on 19 April, the steamer encountered rain. At 6 p.m., they lowered a cutter and picked up a life belt marked Allen Line. Now to this day, we don't really know how it got there, but they probably just picked it up because they thought there could be a body in it. But when they bought it on board, they realized it's just a life belt marked Allen Line. On the morning of 20th April, westbound German steamer SS Bremen's passengers were the first to see the bodies of Titanic victims. The passengers were shocked to see the bodies initially because they thought these would be pieces of ice or birds, but then the truth was revealed that these are actually bodies. And the captain announced that these are the victims of Titanic, which sank 5 days earlier. A lot of details provided by the people on board have survived till present day. For example, some details include that there were bodies huddling together, there were women with children, and there were 2 men on a makeshift raft. And what I believe was the most famous of all was a woman with a dog, supposedly Saint Bernard. We don't really know her identity to this day, but they say it was Anne Isham, a famous candidate for this. But we don't really know because it's still debated whether she actually had a dog or not. But on the deck, people fainted and wailed. The captain was later asked about the bodies, and he said he did not stop to pick them up because even if he did not have any sources to take care of them. He said they were everywhere. There were men, women, and children. All had life preservers on. I counted 125, then grew sick of the sight, and there may have been as many as 150 or 200 bodies. And some other witnesses said pretty much similar stuff. And here's something you may not know. This photograph you're seeing was taken by a crewman on board, Stefan Rehoric, if I pronounced it correctly. And eyewitnesses said that they actually saw a red streak on this iceberg. And by the way, no photographs of the bodies and debris field has surfaced yet, although many descriptions do exist. You might be surprised, but on the Bremen there was an 11-year-old German girl, Leonie Hermann. And when she saw the body of a woman clasping her baby, she was haunted by it and she was afraid to sail back home. And because of that, she settled down in the US. And in April 2012, her grandson mentioned that she never stopped thinking about how she could have saved that child, what she could have possibly done, and all that. And in an ironic twist of fate, he said those victims actually ended up saving her life because she chose to stay back in the US and did not go back to Europe. While back in Europe, 2 world wars occurred, and in the Second World War, her hometown Dresden was bombed by the Allied forces and her father was killed. Now, there might be much more similar stories like that, but this is one that has reached down to us. Regarding testimonies from the Rhine, there is one published on 2nd of May 1912 which says Newark woman passed over Titanic coast through wreckage in the Weekly Advocate newspaper. And in this testimony, she mentions that the bodies were in such condition that they couldn't tell their gender. And she says that her ship was the first that came across the disaster site. And it mentions the captain's testimony, who has been at sea for 65 years and retires the next year, quoted saying, "This was the toughest crossing he had to do because of the ice fields." Now, needless to say, the whole thing shocked everyone. The captain of another steamer, SS Rhine, held multiple lifeboat drills, and the passengers actually slept dressed in their warm clothes to rush to the boat deck in moments' notice. And the Rhine sent the coordinates of this to the mackay-bennett. At 7 p.m., the mackay-bennett arrived at the edge of Debris Field. Of the logbooks on board, only 2 have survived till our present day, those belonging to cable engineer Hamilton and Clifford Crease. Hamilton made entry on 20th April in his diary. "We are now very near the area where lie the ruins of so many human hopes and prayers." The next day, the recovery began at 5 a.m. So the mackay-bennett had 2 cutters, and they lowered these cutters and they would bring back few bodies. Now the captain realized that the bodies were too many to be carried back ashore. So he devised a plan, a rather controversial plan. The plan said that unless a body was beyond preservation, in which case it would have to be buried at sea no matter what, first class passengers would be embalmed and placed in coffins. Second class would be embalmed and wrapped in canvas bags. And third class would be wrapped in canvas bags and buried at sea, with some exceptions, like if their body was in a good condition to be carried ashore. Unidentified bodies were also mostly buried at sea, with some exceptions. And crew members were also buried at sea because Lander himself said he preferred burial at sea over land burial for himself, because he like them, was a sailor. And since they were sailors, it would be somewhat of, from his perspective, an honor to be buried at sea. Now, there were exceptions, and these exceptions were basically crew members. They were embalmed but not wrapped in anything, just placed on ice. And later when the ship arrived, the workers complained that these bodies were damaged badly because of this. Now, there is something worth mentioning here, that the plan was not religiously followed. Lander's excuse was that rich people own estates and properties, and the bodies were necessary to obtain death certificates for them in some cases, because he said if there's no death certificate, then there will be fights over these estates and properties, unlike the bodies of common people who didn't have much financial significance. Not to mention, there were actually lots of rich people who offered generous sums to whoever recovered their loved ones' bodies. And Mr. Astor's body was the most prized one, to the point the crew was ordered to keep an eye for it. And it's also worth mentioning that some bodies were just buried at sea because they either couldn't be preserved or because the crew had run out of embalming fluid. And the law was that if a body is not embalmed, then you cannot bring it back to the shore. And it's also worth mentioning that, like I said, some bodies, despite not belonging to first and second class, they were simply kept because they were in good condition. At 8 p.m., under the glow of crescent moon, the bell is rung on the forecastle. All the crew members head to the forecastle where a burial at sea is being conducted by the Reverend. Now, 51 bodies were recovered on this day according to both logbooks. 46 men, as both agree, but Crees says 4 women and 1 baby, whereas Hamilton says 3 women and 2 children. So we can realize that Crees probably counts a girl as a woman, whereas Hamilton counts her as a child, and the baby was male. But they dispute the number buried at sea the same day, because Crees says 24 men. Hamilton just says 30 bodies. On the 22nd April, the logbooks once again appear to somewhat contradict each other. Hamilton says they steamed past the iceberg which he tried to photograph, but it started raining, so he gave up, and he mentions that they lowered a cutter to inspect a lifeboat, but it was severely smashed and they couldn't even make out the ship's name. And he mentions that the bodies recovered, but he does not tell how many were they. And he says some of them were nearly 15 miles from where they had recovered bodies the previous day. At 8 p.m., the burial at sea was conducted. Now, Crees, on the other hand, he says the weather was fine and they picked up 26 bodies, of which they buried 15 at sea. On the 23rd of April, once again they contradict each other on weather, because Crees says it was fine, but Hamilton says there was rain and the fog lifted for a while and then grew denser than before. Both agree that they stopped the Allen Line steamer Sardinian and they took some canvas from it through cutters. And Crees says they picked up 128 bodies and did not bury any at sea, while Hamilton simply says the cutters were busy the whole day recovering bodies. He gives no numbers at all. On 24th April, both logbooks agree that the weather was tensely foggy, and Hamilton even mentions the sea was rough. They buried 77 bodies according to both sources, with Crees giving details that they buried 3 at a time. On the 25th, only Crees made an entry under this date with the following details: weather fine, picked up 87 bodies, 84 men and 3 women, did not bury any. On the 26th, White Star realized that one ship won't be enough, so they chartered another cable ship to join the recovery effort, the Minia. Crees mentions that they picked up 14 bodies before beginning the voyage home. Hamilton just says they picked up a total of 306 bodies, of which 116 were buried at sea. The mackay-bennett's voyage home only appears in the logbook belonging to Crees. He writes that they were steaming towards Halifax on the 27th. On the 28th, they were forced to reduce the speed to half because of rough weather, and the rough weather continued till 29th, so they were proceeding but slowly. On the 30th, the mackay-bennett arrived in Halifax with the 190 recovered bodies, and they delivered them to Mayflower Curling Club's ice rink. And this ice rink was temporarily converted into a morgue where people would come and identify the bodies. The churches rang their bells and flags flew on half-mast, and people rushed into the streets as the ship arrives. Hamilton writes that he was shocked to see the enthusiasm of the press and the general public over 190 lifeless bodies, and he compares this when on 12 Feb they had brought ashore 6 sailors from the schooner Caledonia which had sunk. He says nobody noticed it, the men just walked off, and only 2 lines in the daily paper appeared, unlike this where everybody was so interested. The CS Mania departed for Halifax and arrived on 26th April. They took all the supplies from mackay-bennett, the additional supplies, and they recovered 17 bodies. And 2 of these bodies, presumed to be those of crewmen, they were buried at sea because they couldn't be identified. The captain also mentions that they came across a body, but they could not pick him up. Then fog settled, and after the fog lifted, they could not find this body again. Now, for those interested, the electrician Francis Drake wrote a letter to his mother in England in which he mentions his side of the story in this mission. And perhaps the creepiest detail mentioned is that for a few days, he and the doctor slept in a room that was surrounded by coffins. And they were surrounded by coffins. On the 2nd of May, the Minia departed the site bound for Halifax, arriving on the 6th of May. The additional embalming supplies were transferred to Canadian government ship, the lighthouse tender Montmagny. And the same day, the Montmagny departed Quebec for Halifax to collect the supplies before sailing towards the site of disaster. Now, you might not be surprised to hear this, but the Montmagny had two captains. One for the port waters, or you can say the home waters of the port, and the other that commanded outside. The Montmagny basically ended up recovering only 4 bodies, and of these 4 bodies, they had to bury one at sea on the 9th of May as it was unidentified. And they also recovered a life buoy, a life ring, which the captain's family still has to this day. And the captain's grandson mentioned in an interview that while they were conducting this burial at sea, the sea was calm and a gentle breeze on a foggy day rang the bell, and this made all the crew members emotional. On the 13th of May, the Montmagny delivered the 3 bodies to Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, and from here they were transported by rail to Halifax. Then the ship returned after gathering more supplies to search for more bodies along the Gulf Stream, but they won't find any. On the 16th of May, the White Star chartered its 4th and last recovery ship, the passenger and cargo steamer and part-time sealer SS Algerine. Coincidentally, this ship was also built by Harland and Wolff. And this ship departed under the command of Captain John Jackman with the following on board. But here's something interesting. There's no record of clergymen on board this time, unlike the 3 other ships, which had clergymen on board to conduct the prayers before the burial. On the 25th of May, they searched the area but found no bodies except for one, the body of first-class saloon steward James McGrady. On 6th of June, they returned to St. John's, and McGrady's body was shipped to Halifax on board the steamer Florizel. White Star Line now called off the search since any bodies not recovered yet, they had either sunk due to decomposition of their life belts or drifted far away, dispersed by the ocean currents, and now they couldn't be found in the vast ocean. Regarding the burials on land, 209 bodies were brought ashore in total by all the 4 ships. And of these, 59 were claimed by their relatives who paid for them to be transported to the desired locations. And of these 59, 3 were cremated while the rest were buried. 150 were either unclaimed or their loved ones couldn't afford to pay for their transportation. So White Star Line paid for their burials and standard gravestones, and the relatives could pay for grander ones. So these 150 victims were buried in 3 graveyards in Halifax. 121 were buried in Fairview Lawn Cemetery, which is non-denominational. 19 were buried in the Roman Catholic Cemetery of Mount Olivet, while 10 were buried in Baron V. Hirsch Cemetery, which is a Jewish cemetery. And you may not know this, but the identification of who was Jewish and who wasn't was actually, it wasn't accurate. And they ended up burying some non-Jews in the Jewish cemetery as well, and their graves are still there to this day. Now here's an interesting but sad story that occurred during this time. During their recovery effort, the crew of Mackay-Bennett had come across the body of an infant, and they could not think of returning him back to the deep. So despite being unidentified, they decided to keep him, and when nobody came to claim him, They paid for his funeral and gravestone using the money given to them by the family of J.J. Astor, the guy who had the most expensive coffin. So on his coffin, they inscribed his name as Our Baby, and on his gravestone, they inscribed Unknown Child, and this gravestone still stands today. Now, as I mentioned earlier, according to Barnstead method, the rule was that all his clothes and shoes would be burned, but the police officer in charge could not think of doing this, so he decided to hide them under his desk. And in 2002, his descendants donated them to Halifax's Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. And in 2008, this child was identified as 1-year-old Sidney Goodwin, an English third-class passenger whose entire family perished, the reason nobody came to claim his body. Now, for those interested, here are some pics of the body recovery as well as the burial at sea. Now, here are my statistics for the recovered bodies, and here's a breakdown provided in table form. So in total, 328 bodies were found in the recovery process, and this is excluding the 4 buried by the Carpathia. Now, if you wish to know how I came to conclude that the number buried from the Carpathia was 4, not more or less, check out my video on the Carpathia's voyage to New York. It's there in detail. 5 bodies were also recovered outside the recovery operation. On the 13th of May, the RMS Oceanic was sailing on a westbound voyage to New York when the lookouts rang the bell. They had seen a boat in the distance some 200 miles of where the Titanic had sunk. And interestingly, one of the passengers on this voyage was the mother of Titanic orphans, the Navratil brothers. And there were some crew members on board who were Titanic survivors. Captain Henry Smith, not related to Titanic's captain at all, he ordered the engines stopped and a boarding party, including the boarding officer and a doctor, were dispatched in an emergency cutter to inspect the situation. When they arrived, they were shocked to see 3 prostrate, blackened bodies of men, one of whom was in his dinner jacket. They tried to sink the boat first, but guess what? It proved unsinkable, so they towed it back to the Oceanic. The 3 men were shrouded, a Union Jack draped over them, and after a prayer service, they removed the flag, and the 3 bodies were buried at sea. They also found the fur coat of Richard Norris Williams and a ring with the inscription of Edward to Gerda on it. Now, the fur coat was returned to Williams, but according to his grandson, who mentioned this in 2005, he said that although the White Star Line had, tried their best to clean it and all that, it was unwearable, so he just threw it away, not long after he received it. And the ring belonged to Gerda Lindell, a third-class passenger from Sweden. What happened was that during the struggle in Collapsible A, she had fallen overboard, and her husband Edward had tried to help her. But then eventually exhaustion overcame him and he lost her. Eyewitnesses said that his hair turned grey, and then he too succumbed to exposure just a few moments after this, and he was also thrown overboard. But at this point, the ring fell from Gerda's hand, and it was later recovered and returned to her father. And you can still see this ring in exhibitions today. Here are the pictures of the process for those interested. Now, when it comes to identifying the bodies, the Barnstead method wasn't used here. So what we do know roughly is that of the 3 men, the guy in the dinner jacket was positively identified as first-class passenger Thomson Beatty from Canada. And in a very tragic coincidence, he was buried close to where his mother was born on a voyage from Europe to Canada in 1830. And you see, because the Barnstead method wasn't followed here, the identities of the 2 other men are not certain at all. because eyewitnesses described both men as sailors or firemen. This gives us some hint to the type of clothes they were wearing, because no description actually survives of what they were wearing exactly. And it is suspected that one of these men was actually an Irish farmer traveling in third class, an Irish American named Arthur O'Keefe. But then again, there's not much to back this up. The Encyclopedia Titanica enlists BT as body number 331, the next man as 332, and the man thought to be Arthur as number 333. On the 6th of June, the tanker SS Ottawa under the command of Captain R.G. Tate came across a body of a man in a lifebelt. This was some 543 miles of where the Titanic had sunk. Third Officer Thomas Cook writes that they lowered a cutter and picked him up. The lifebelt did not have the ship's name on it, as it must have been washed away, but they searched him, and from his effects they identified him as First Class Steward William Thomas Curley. His body was badly decomposed, especially the face and hands, and so they buried him at sea after a funeral as per the rites of the Church of England. On the 8th of June, the freighter SS Ilford was eastbound from Galveston to Hamburg when the chief officer Bassett spotted a floating object from his binoculars. They lowered a lifeboat with the chief officer, the third officer, and 2 sailors, and they discovered a body was being held by a lifebelt, a floating body. So they brought him on board and they searched him, and from the letters, Christmas cards, and postcards found on him, they identified him as First Class Saloon Steward William Cheverton. They found a watch and chain, a bunch of keys, a knife, and a silver pencil case, and they handed over these to the British consulate in Hamburg to be dispatched to the address mentioned in the letters found. Then he was buried at sea, being the last ever victim to be recovered. Now you might ask, do the sightings of bodies end here? Well, the answer is not necessarily no. So you see, in the book On a Sea of Glass and The Titanic, End of a Dream, they both contain narrations that Scandinavian migrants bound for Minnesota came across bodies which their ships knocked into the air, and they claimed about it to President Taft. The trouble, however, is that these narrations are both questionable, and most likely what happened, in my own opinion, is that the testimonies of some passengers from the Rhine and Bremen, they got mixed up. Most likely the Bremen, because the Bremen sailed from Bremerhaven, which was closest to Scandinavia, and thus carried Scandinavian migrants, a great deal of whom were bound for Minnesota. And then this got mixed up by writers, and as a result, this testimony was created. And there is no doubt that the narrations are similar to what was said by people on the Bremen. Now there's another proposed theory about the bodies that I would also like to mention. So you see, the mackay-bennett, they did not come across the sightings reported by the passengers of the Bremen and Rhine. The woman with children clasped in her arms, the huddled men, the makeshift raft, the woman with the large dog, they came across none of this. And this has led some enthusiasts to believe that there could have been more than one body field. So you see, much of the people that were recovered were last seen on the port side, while many significant figures last seen on the starboard side were never recovered. Now definitely the currents and the storm that came before the mackay-bennett reached definitely played a part in this. But the theory basically says that perhaps there was more than one body field, but while the mackay-bennett was busy with the body field they came across, the currents just carried the other field far away. So by the time the mackay-bennett finished, they just They just had to leave, and other ships, by the time they reached, the bodies had been dispersed far away. As for my stats, they are based on my own list of bodies, which also includes their identities that were identified long after 1912, and even today some enthusiasts have taken it upon themselves to identify the unidentified bodies. Now the final question that often gets asked is about human remains. Are there any human remains in the wreck? So Dr. Robert Ballard, the man who discovered the Titanic, believes that there might be some human remains in parts of the ship still buried under the mud. In 2001, Charles Pellegrino claimed that his team came across a human finger encircled by the remains of a wedding ring on the bottom of a soup tureen they retrieved. And on the next dive, they returned this finger to the bottom of the ocean once again. But this is questionable for two reasons. First, because Pellegrino is known for being into pseudo-history, and secondly, because no other source backs this up. Here are some of the pictures of boots at the wreck site. Now these boots were tanned with tannic acid, which is why they haven't decayed yet, and they will be there. You will also find some boots lying in pairs where the bodies once lay. But don't be confused, because some of these boots don't belong to bodies wearing them, but they came from destroyed suitcases and all that. But definitely there are boots that lay in pairs where bodies once rested.